Hey there, this video is going to be about me taking apart my rear subframe. That includes rear suspension, brakes, differential, all that stuff. It's not going to be a step-by-step guide, but I'll do my best to cover all the big stuff. Well, let's get into it. I started out by cutting out the exhaust with a sawzall since there was no way those rusted bolts were going to come out. I pulled at it for a while and it was pretty difficult getting the right angle on it, but eventually I was able to pull the exhaust out. Thankfully it's a MagnaFlow exhaust, so I will be reusing it to save some money. It is a dual pipe, so it's a little bit heavier. Next up, I loosened up the axle bolts. I actually used a C-clamp on the brake calipers to keep the axles from spinning. I decided to take apart the subframe piece by piece to make things easier, since I don't have very much space to work with in my garage. My impact gun wasn't quite enough to take these off, so I had to use a ratchet. The axle came off of the differential fairly easily after I dropped everything. Unfortunately, it wasn't so easy getting the axle out of the upright. I used an impact hammer, a regular hammer, a flywheel puller and a hammer, a little bit of heat, some penetrating oil, and then a flywheel puller and a hammer again, which you can see I actually bent the threads on the puller by mistake. Eventually I gave up and decided to try and take the control arms off. Unfortunately, there's not enough space to get the bolts off on the inner side, so I switched to the outer side to try and take the upright off. Springs were easy to remove, they just pulled right out. I'd already spent quite a bit of time redoing the brake lines, putting on stainless steel brake lines, and rebuilding the calipers, but it all had to come off to get the suspension off. The lower control arm, also known as salad tongs, was a little annoying to get out since it wanted to expand on the bottom. I had already gutted the parking brake components. I was considering rebuilding it, but it doesn't look like I'm going to use any of that stuff. I had already taken the sway bar off, so the last thing I had to do was disconnect the trailing arm.
Is that out yet or what? No? There we go.
With that stuff out of the way, I moved on to the differential. I had to put the car in gear to prevent the driveshaft from spinning so I could get the bolts out, which were similar to the axle bolts. The differential mounts weren't hard, but it was tricky dropping it out. I'm not reusing the whole differential, just the input and output flanges, so I wasn't too careful. In another video, I'll cover the differential swap and the limited slip kit I'm going to install, so stay tuned for that.
Thud.
I was finally able to get the control arms out now the differential wasn't in the way. I had to cut the parking brake cables out since they were being a huge pain in the ass in the front and the rear of the subframe. Even with everything taken out, it was still quite tricky getting the subframe out because of the studs in the front. Initially I was worried about rust penetrating all the way through the subframe, but it doesn't look quite that bad. I think if I wire wheel it and then apply some rust converter and a coat of paint, I should be fine. You can see the parking brake cables are still stuck in the subframe, so I'll have to cut those out even more. All the bushings are going to be replaced with Condor Speed Shop solid bushings. So that's 4 bushings for the subframe and 3 for the differential. The differential bushings were looking pretty bad, so it was about time for those to get replaced. I'll be replacing the lower control arms, hopefully the upper control arm bushings since they don't look too good, and the trailing arm bushings are from Condor Speed Shop as well. Not sure how I'm going to get the axles out, but I hope to rebuild them. The next video is going to be removing the subframe bushings, doing some reconditioning, and installing new ones, so stay tuned.